Okay, so we were talking yesterday about the election of 1916. I thought I'd show y'all who Wilson defeats in the election of 1916. This is the former governor of New York, Charles Evans Hughes. He is a Supreme Court justice. He is a moderate progressive. He's a fairly liberal guy for as far as Republicans go. Now, I told you in 1916, who was still very healthy and very much alive was Theodore Roosevelt, but Roosevelt's concerned that there will be a division at the Republican convention and that will, lead to two candidates again. And if there's one thing TR can't stand, it's Wilson, right? So he decides not to run, not to be the candidate, not to seek being the candidate. And in its wake, in the election, Charles Evans Hughes becomes the nominee. Now, the problem with Hughes is he accuses Wilson of being soft on the war, as in not doing anything to prepare America for what's going on in Europe, not getting us ready for the war. Well, that sounds like, to the mind of isolationists, like somebody who wants us to get involved in World War I. And that actually backfires badly. That actually lands fully in Wilson's "he kept us out of war" slogan. So Wilson is going to run literally on a platform of opposing admission into World War I, opposing entering World War I. Wilson goes to bed at night on the night of the election thinking he's lost. He's lost. If you can see up here, the returns are starting to come in. He's lost the Northeast. He loses New York. He loses Pennsylvania. He expects to win the South, but you guys should know by now, these are key states, population states, right? So if he doesn't win the Rust Belt or the Northeast, he's going to lose. Well, it comes down to California this time. For the first time really in our voting history, California is the swing state. I know, and Wilson is going to carry California by less than 4,000 votes. And so the reason is, and you should certainly know this, out west is a very, very strong isolationist sentiment. So particularly in these states right here. So this part of the country here, now keep in mind the Northeast is much more, I'm not going to say supportive of going into the war, but it's more probable because they're the ones whose ships are getting messed with. You understand? So they are more supportive of the Republican, plus they typically vote Republican anyway, except for New York, sometimes a swing state now. So Wilson gets reelected, and then this is a big deal because, if you remember in 1912, he got elected because he was a plurality winner. More people voted against him than for him, but this time he wins the election. And he is going to give a speech that is called his Peace Without Victory speech. So if you're asked a question about Wilson and his, how he wants America's role in terms of what's going on in Europe, he says we're not going to get involved. And what this means is he says we'll be willing to negotiate the end to the war. He wants them to, he wants the American public to recognize that we should not have a role in this thing. So he's trying to maintain our historic isolationism. However, he believes, and he's, I think at the time, probably right, that the war cannot end without a solution, i.e. no one's going to win this war. They're just going to keep killing each other. And if you know anything about World War I, 14, 15, 16, 17, 14, 15, 16, that's, 4 of the bloodiest years in history. Some of the worst battles ever. First Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun. These are some of the most colossally devastating battles ever at that point. And what happens is, and by the way, I do want to remind you, I think I sort of started out on this with thinking you knew what World War I was about. So maybe I should remind you who's involved in World War I. If I were relying on if I were relying on your experience from World History 2, you might recall what the participants in World War I were. But if you've forgotten who was in World War I, reminder that there is an assassination in Bosnia of the Austrian Archduke, right? And when he is assassinated, this sort of dominoes of countries fall into the war. And this is not European history class. So I'm not going to bother teaching you that, but I will teach you this. And so I should throw these guys in here. So let me go ahead and insert this, and hopefully that'll make sense. So during World War I, there were two sides to the war. Okay, two sides to the war. And I don't care if you know who the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente were. Those were actual alliances that predate the war. But once the war breaks out, the alliances are going to lead to the following. So you have the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. That's this country. His son is killed. His neighbor is Germany, and the Kaiser has been building up powerful military, particularly Navy and soldiers, and they want to punish the country that they hold responsible, which is Serbia, right? Well, Serbia has the guaranteed protection of Russia, the largest Slavic country on earth. Russia is an ally of France's, right? So when Russia enters into the war against Germany and Austria, the French are going to be attacked by the Germans because the Germans have a very stiff military plan called the Schlieffen Plan, which for their planning, they have to attack France and Russia. So they're like, all right, we're going to attack France, then Russia. Knock France out of the war, go to Russia, right? That's what we're going to do, they think. But when they attack France, they go through Belgium. You know, this is a very important moment. They go through Belgium, and when they go through Belgium, that violates Belgium's neutrality. So I'll show you that too. And the problem with that is, put it in there. When they go through Belgium, this is their quick attack through Belgium to get to Paris. This is where you have the Battle of the First Marne to protect Paris from being taken. You know, the plan is to knock them out. Well, that means Britain is going to enter the war. So if you're looking now at who the Allied powers are, all right, well, let's start with the central. So when Britain enters the war, one of Britain's traditional enemies is the Ottoman Empire. And they're also one of Russia's traditional enemies. So the Ottomans enter the war with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. So they're the central powers. Now, Italy had been in an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but when they saw the Brits and the French and the Russians shaping up, they switched sides. They're like, those guys look like they're going to win. Japan will also join the Allied powers. Bulgaria, as a sort of outpost of the Ottoman Empire, will also join the Central Powers. I don't care about Bulgaria and Japan in this war. So for our purposes, this war will be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which your book calls Turkey, and it wasn't. It wasn't Turkey yet. All right, against the Brits, the French, the Russians, and the Italians. So this is one of the reasons why it's called World War. Now, if you know anything about European history, there have been several wars that involve those very players. But this war is going to get that nickname later. All right, here's just an idea of who the bad guys and the good guys were, so-called. You have the Tsar of Russia, the King of Britain, the King of Italy, and the President of France. All right, so royalty, 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 and elected president. Then you have the King of Germany, who is a cousin of the King of Britain and the King of Russia. All right, they're all kinfolk, you know. And then you've got the head of the Ottoman Empire and the head of Austria-Hungary. So these are the central powers. And of course, we are neutral, right? So on January 22nd, after millions of people have died, Wilson proposes that America's role will be to negotiate a peace. So sort of like if you think about like TR mediating the Russo-Japanese War. Like America is going to help end the war. But the Germans have different plans. Now, I want to remind you, at this point in history, it seems like we are more closely aligned with the British, right? We have an ancient traditional culture that we share. We are linguistic, similar peoples, right? We have the same language, and we were major trade partners. So that seems like the side we should be on, right? Plus, Britain and France are democratic, okay? And Germany and Austria-Hungary are absolute monarchies. But Russia is an absolute monarchy, so we don't really like that, right? And there are 11 million Germans and Austro-Hungarians in America. And so there's a whole lot of sympathy to them, you know, in America. So we've just decided, or President Wilson has decided, we're just going to remain neutral, peace without victory. Teddy Roosevelt is infuriated. He thinks we're siding. Keep in mind, if you're neutral while someone is being killed who's a good guy, then that's, in the mind of Theodore Roosevelt, like taking the side of the bad guy. But Theodore Roosevelt is not going to be happy about this, and he's going to accuse Wilson of being a lily-livered pacifist, like another weakling. He's very much critical of President Wilson's position here of peace without victory. But what happens, and I know I've kind of fast-forwarded through some of your reading, but I should kind of give you some background. One of the things that's a problem, and I think Wilson doesn't go as far as Jefferson here. Wilson does not have Congress issue an embargo act, right? So Americans are going to still be traveling to and from the continent and from Britain. And more importantly, I think long-term, Americans are going to have merchant vessels traveling back and forth between those countries. So we're carrying goods to Britain and France, right? And the Germans are absolutely stuck. The Germans are behind a blockade. So I'll give you a little more world history here. I guess I should update my PowerPoint to have more world history in it, right? Let me show you what the Germans are dealing with. Try to show you what the Germans are doing. Oh, maybe I can't. Yeah, there it is. So what the Brits have done is what the Brits always do, and that is to create a magnificent blockade. Okay, so once the war progresses, the Brits put their warships from the coast of Ireland to the North Sea and down to the English Channel. So it's like just like a blockade. So that the Germans, and of course the Brits still control the Mediterranean. So the Germans are stuck. They can't get to their colonies, or they can't trade with other people like, say, America. So the only way the Germans feel they can beat the blockade is through the development of a new weapon. And that is called in German, Unterseeboot, right? Underwater boat. We in America, of course, know it to be a submarine. And so the German submarines are going to start attacking vessels that are bound for Britain, particularly, right? Targeting mostly British ships. And the reason is they want to sort of strangle Britain's trade. Keep in mind, Britain is an island, and it relied on its British Empire, India and Southeast Asia and Africa. It needed all those raw materials to feed its empire or to run its empire. And of course, they need to trade with America. So the Germans then will start sinking every ship bound for Britain, right? Well, that's going to do the obvious then. At some point, it was bound to happen, and it does. On May 1915, now keep in mind, this has already happened when the election takes place. But on May 1915, this happens. And this infuriates a lot of Americans, because on the Lusitania are 128 Americans who are killed. Now, some would argue the Germans had a reason to sink the Lusitania, like a legitimate reason. Now, first of all, I should tell you the Lusitania is like the sister ship to the HMS Titanic. It was built by the same people in Ireland, by the same crew, So it's a very similar ship to the Titanic. So imagine a big, giant steamship. It is a passenger liner. So imagine like a Royal Caribbean cruise ship or a Carnival cruise ship. But unbeknownst to the passengers, now I will say this, Wilson has warned people, you're sailing into a war zone, it's risky. But on the ship, American war munitions manufacturers are smuggling weapons to Britain. So American manufacturers of guns have weapons in the hold of the Lusitania, which I consider a terrible action too. Like if I'm on a Royal Caribbean cruise line, I hope that America doesn't have hidden war weapons on it. So the Germans know this and they sink the ship. But that means they kill women and children. Innocent civilians go down in the water in the Irish Sea. And this really starts to turn public opinion against the Germans. But overwhelmingly, Americans still want to be isolationists. So think about it. The election happens after this, and he kept us out of war, right? Well, then the Germans are going to sink another ship, which I don't have a PowerPoint slide of, called the Arabic. and 2 Americans will be killed on it. And then they'll damage another ship. It won't sink, but it'll be wounded, so to speak, damaged, called the Sussex, a French ship. And 2 Americans will be injured on that. So after the Sussex gets attacked, Wilson demands that the Germans stop what is called unrestricted submarine warfare. And Wilson basically threatens sort of dire consequences if they continue. Like, this could be what we would call a casus belli. Like, you keep killing Americans on unarmed ships, we might have to enter this. Well, that's too much. William Jennings Bryan quits. You remember William Jennings Bryan was Wilson's Secretary of State? Well, even Wilson saying a little bit, like provocatively at all, is too much for Bryan. Bryan is an absolute isolationist and doesn't want to. Remember, he was an anti-imperialist, but he's also relatively a pacifist. So he's like, I quit. So the Secretary of State quits. Not that he was going to do a whole lot. And then Wilson issues, we might call this an ultimatum to the Germans, and it becomes known in history as the Sussex Pledge. All right. Now, to be fair, again, the Germans don't agree to this. The Germans agree. The Sussex Pledge says we promise not to sink ships without warning. So that's different from unrestricted. Unrestricted sub-warfare means when these guys sank these ships here, the terrible thing about the U-boat, I should tell you this, the terrible thing about the U-boat is it only holds like 20 people, the crew. And so when a torpedo hits a big vessel, it's underwater, the torpedo, and there's no warning. And so the Lusitania sank in 15 minutes. 15 minutes without warning means what people can't do is get on lifeboats. You understand? They're not going to survive that sinking. Keep in mind, this is the Irish Sea. It's cold, and they're going to drown. So Wilson doesn't like that. He doesn't like this killing of innocent people. And so he tells the Germans, you have to stop doing that. You have to at least give them warning. Now, remember, if a naval ship attacks another ship, it can rescue the people out of the water and keep them as prisoners on the naval ship, like a destroyer or a battleship, right? But a submarine can't do that. A submarine sinks your boat, you're going underwater. So Wilson says, no more of that. And the Germans sort of, toy with the idea, but they put a string on it, a string attached, you might say, or a condition that says the Americans have to negotiate with the Brits to lift their blockade. Well, there's no way that's going to happen. The British are not going to lift their blockade. So Wilson goes ahead and says, well, you guys agreed to it. And so we have this thing on the books kind of thing called the Sussex Pledge. But what's going to happen is the Germans are then going to really start gambling, because after 4 years, they've run out of soldiers just about. But keep in mind, what hasn't happened yet will happen this year is the Russian Revolution, right? Right now, the bulk of the Germans are actually in Russia, not in France. So they're afraid they're going to lose because they're going to run out of men. And they also think the Brits might be really close to losing economically, right? And so they're going to gamble and resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They're going to violate the Sussex Pledge. But that doesn't prompt Wilson to enter the war, even though he kind of threatened that that's what he would do. So there's a list I have of 3 things in my mind that lead America into World War I. The first is the violation of the Sussex Pledge, or the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. But we're not there yet. Keep in mind, the people that are least bothered by this are all those Westerners. Like, they don't care about submarine warfare in the Atlantic. They don't want to see their boys go die for a European problem, right? So then Wilson responds by starting to put things like guns and depth charges on merchant ships so that American ships can be sort of protected to a degree. So we're still traveling. Keep in mind, the ability of a country to trade with another country is called the freedom of the seas. Okay? And so Wilson's not going to put the embargo on. He's not going to do what Jefferson did. He's going to keep trading. He's warned passengers, hey, you guys, you better watch out. He doesn't ban travel yet, no travel ban yet. And then here comes the second and third. And the second is really, really remarkable. It is called the Zimmerman Note. Now, first of all, it's kind of like the height of stupidity of the Germans. You cannot get an information to anywhere in the Americas without sending it through Ireland. We were the only transatlantic cable receiver in New York from Ireland. Cyrus Field had laid that cable, which meant it was going to have to go through the Brits' hands. The Germans were using secret codes. Well, their code had been broken by the Brits. The Brits intercept a code from their foreign minister of Germany named Arthur Zimmerman. And once they decode it, this is what it says. That's why it says from London on there, because the Brits decode the German letter. And it says, we being the Germans, we intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. So they're saying we're going to resume this, right? We expect it to come. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the U.S. neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make to Mexico a proposal of an alliance. We will make war together, peace together, get generous financial support for you, and that will then lead you to reconquer Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So I know it seems weird, right? Like, why would the Germans say, hey, Mexicans, go to war with America? But you should remember, there were Americans all over Mexico at this point. You guys remember Pancho Villa? Jack Pershing's raid into Mexico is happening while this is going on. So they assume wrongly that Mexico will see them as an ally against the American imperialists. The Mexicans aren't stupid. They're like, this is Carranza, and he realizes that if this were to happen, who would really be waging war on America? Mexico. Mexico would do it all. It wouldn't be like Germany coming over here and fighting against the Americans. It would be the Mexicans fighting against Americans. We know how that works out in history. So, they say, no way. Plus, the fact that it gets intercepted means he never really gets the message anyway. But even more important than that, this gets published in the American newspapers. When Americans start to read that the Germans are proposing to wage war on America with our neighbor, you can imagine that upsets a lot of people. But not the Westerners. They're still isolationists. Even this isn't enough to provoke them, right? So definitely know the Zimmerman note or the Zimmerman telegram, all right? They even mentioned Japan in there if you keep reading. So at that point, the Germans then make their fatal mistake, and that is 4 ships are bound for England, bound for Britain, from our country, and the Germans sink them. So as one of my students said years ago, they sank our boats. And so when they sank our boats, this is a casus belli. Now they're openly attacking our ships. So this is like being in a fight without fighting, we're being beat up and not doing anything. So Wilson has to, in his mind, make this decision to join the war against Germany. Now, the war effort is greatly benefited from the American perspective, from our perspective, when Russia drops out of the war. In other words, we did not really want to be on each side of a country that had an absolute monarchy. Tsar Nicholas was a terrible ruler. We didn't want to be like his team. But I will say this, and yet often people don't realize this, we do not formally join any alliance during this. We are not a member of the Allied powers, in spite of what you might have been taught. We are an associate power, meaning we fight against Germany in association with Britain and France. But we never, Wilson has no intention of joining some sort of military agreement with these other countries, like a treaty. So Wilson asked, and he says a terrible thing to lead this great nation into war. He ran on it, but he kept us out of war, right? But those 3 things are more than enough in my mind, and way more than enough in TR's mind, for us to go to war, right? The violation of the Sussex Pledge, the Zimmerman note, and then the sinking of 4 American unarmed ships. So Wilson then gets our declaration of war. Congress is not at all unanimous on this. There is a lot of opposition. You have your first Congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin, votes against it from Montana. But you have lots of other Republicans vote against the declaration, as well as Western Democrats who voted, as isolationists. So yes, she's the only person who voted against World War I and World War II. She was a pacifist by beliefs. That was her philosophical or ethical beliefs. So she was going to, you could probably have been fighting a war to liberate anybody, and she would have opposed war as a solution. Okay. So the book talks about, and I think it's cool that it mentions this because sometimes this stuff doesn't come up, but the book talks about JP Morgan had loaned over $2 billion to the Allies, right? That JP Morgan, right? American factories, a handful, were selling guns to the Brits and the French. Not as many as they could, but so there's a theory that these bankers and war munitions people pulled us into war. After World War I is over, there'll be a Senate investigation, and a group called the Nye Committee will call them merchants of death. And that sounds reasonable. I mean, I'm certainly aware of what are called the masters of war, right? But the book makes a very good argument, which I tend to agree with, and that is these guys were getting absolutely rich off of the war without us being in it. Once we were in it, then they're going to have much more government, getting in their way, right? And so they were much freer to practice their trade of war effort when we were neutral. Now that we were in the war, government's going to have a little more oversight, a little more regulations, just in general, more government. So I think that there's a fair argument. Although, what I've learned about war munitions salesmen is they benefit either way. They'll sell to anybody. I don't know if you guys are aware or not, but pretty much there are only two weapons mostly around the world during the 1960s and 70s. That was the M16 and the AK-47. America and Russia by far the world's largest arms producers. By like a mile. So they're going to sell them either way. But yeah, I don't think that they caused the war, particularly because I don't think they had an influence over Woodrow Wilson. They're not going to persuade Wilson to do anything. He didn't like those kind of people. So anywho, let's get on into it then. So one of the greatest challenges facing Wilson is how do you convince a good portion of the country that is isolationist to support the war? Apparently, sinking our boats ain't enough. Well, they shouldn't have been there. We asked for it. We shouldn't have sent guys over the water. So this is where, unfortunately, the salesmanship is so good that it oversells it. So Wilson wants to convince the American people that this is a great war, right? This is why Wilson is an idealist, we would call, as far as in his foreign policy. Wilson's foreign policy is called idealism. George Washington's foreign policy is called realism. Nothing wrong with having an idealistic goal. Ideals are dreams, they're hopes, they're aspirations. But if you convince people that those aspirations are what they are, you better deliver, right? And I'll give you a good example as a parallel if you want some recent history to see as something similar. I'll take you back to the year 2001. In September 2001, we were attacked by a terrorist group in multiple places. You guys know 9/11. Well, the people who were advisors to President Bush wanted to not only dispatch Al-Qaeda, which they certainly did want to, they also wanted to topple governments that were not democratic. They were what we call neoconservatives, and they didn't like non-democratic countries. And so they said, well, hey, let's go after some of those countries. And the one they picked first, Iraq. Now, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. In fact, Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden couldn't stand each other. They were like polar opposites on the angry Muslim scale, right? They couldn't stand each other. But, the Bush administration said, we're going to go after Saddam and topple his regime. But they needed a reason, And so the reason that was the American people were told is that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. WMD. Well, guys, that's realism. If they've got potential nuclear or biological or chemical weapons that threaten America's safety, go for it. Knock those suckers out, right? We don't want those kind of weapons in America. Problem is, they weren't there. They actually didn't exist. They had false evidence, they had false information. So when we invade Iraq and can't find those weapons, the war will have a new name. They'll actually change the name of the war, and it will become Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so now, why are we invading Iraq? To liberate Iraq and bring democracy to it. Well, that's a very, very different goal than get the weapons, right? Get the weapons makes sense to Americans because it's realist. Bring democracy to the Middle East by killing Americans, that doesn't sound so realistic. So that's one of the reasons why the Bush administration ended unpopular, is that we didn't find the weapon. In fact, they asked President Bush later if he had one regret, and he said, yeah, they didn't find any weapons. He, the president, said that. So Wilson had a reason for war. Remember, that's casus belli, right? It's got a reason for war. Freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas is why we fought another war. Anybody remember? What other war was fought for freedom of the seas? Well, the Barbary. Yes, that's true. The Tripolitan War. The War of 1812 also. When the British were stopping our ships on the high seas. But yeah, excellent. Both the Barbary Coast War and the Tripolitan War and the War of 1812. So that is a casus belli. When your ships are attacked on the high seas by other countries. That's not good enough. So he is going to come up with, and this is very Wilsonian, like this is classic Woodrow Wilson. The real reason we're going to join World War I is to make the world safe for democracy. And this will be the war to end all wars. Man, that sounds awesome. Who doesn't want to do that, right? Who doesn't want to do their patriotic cause to end war? And the problem is, and this is, I really want y'all to take home, and I think it's actually in your book too, or it's alluded to in your book. Let me take a look here. So, you know, I'm all the way down to number 43. So in 42, he needed to, you know, find ways to gain support. Now, here's the problem. When you shape it as an isolationist argument versus a moral crusade, you better be sure that that's the outcome, right? And when the war doesn't produce that outcome, what it then leads to in the minds of many Americans is a great sense of disillusionment about any involvement in foreign affairs. So it means the illusion that we were going to end warfare and make Europe safe for democracy, or the world, when that doesn't happen, they're going to be cynical about the next time somebody says we need to get involved in a European conflict. Let that conflict be known as World War II. So throughout the 1920s, when you have Mussolini rise, and into the 30s, when you have Hitler rise, America is head in the sand isolationism. We are not interested at all in that problem. And so when World War II comes to us, we are grotesquely unprepared for it. Now, I'm not saying we don't win in the end, we do. But what World War I does at the end, I'm going to get the cart before the horse here, but what it does in the end is it creates a sense that Wilson deceived us. You know, Wilson didn't deliver on his promises because Wilson couldn't. This is one of those things like President Bush cannot make Iraq safe for democracy. Who has to make Iraq safe for democracy? Iraqis. Do you understand? If you want to make the world safe for democracy, well, the world has to do that, right? And how in the world can you say we're going to end all wars? Like, seriously, how can you make that claim? But he's going to so convince the American people, his presidency, that we buy it. You know, and so idealism, if you can deliver on it, is fantastic. Reagan was both a realist and an idealist who delivered on the end of the Cold War. You know, he used a big stick while speaking softly, right? Wilson is speaking softly without a stick, right? And that's not very smart, as you might imagine. So what is Wilson's big dream to create, as he called it, a new world order? So if you jump down to number 46, his overall goal, it was two goals. One is to inspire the people of the world. You know, he wants to inspire the Allies and the American public. You know, here Wilson, the professor, has a 14-step plan for a new world order. That's his goal, and that's ambitious. And everything in his goals are positive. You know, I mean, they're all objectives that are really great. Get rid of the secret treaties that caused World War I. No more of that. Like, make sure people know who's in an arrangement with who, right? Freedom of the seas. That's why we're fighting this war. Ships should be able to sail unprovoked in international waters. Free trade. Now, that's a huge one, you know, because he is shaping the end of tariffs not simply as a less tax issue, but as countries that trade with each other don't tend to fight each other. And he is absolutely right. That is a fact. Reduction of armaments and armed forces, a demilitarized world. Like, you know, have you guys ever heard about what would World War IV look like? You know, World War III would be, you know, World War I is fought with like rifles and horses and baby tanks. World War II is fought with flamethrowers and airplanes and big time tanks. World War III would be fought with nuclear weapons. World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones, right? Yeah, in other words, like we go back to the cave age, that kind of thing. So he believed that there was an evolution to militarism. Like, you have to, and he's absolutely right. Now, he doesn't use the phrase military-industrial complex. That would be someone like the Eisenhower would use later. But if you just want a sense of perspective, the only thing in America spends more money on than, or as much money on as old people, is munitions, right? And so when you spend billions and billions, $680 billion a year, I think we're at somewhere around in there. When you spend that many billions of dollars, you end up getting stuff like this. Right? I mean, I should go ahead and show it to you, because I am absolutely opposed to militarism as a student of military history. So you get things like the F-35, right? The F-35 program for 10 jets cost I think, what was it, $20 billion per jet? No, that can't be right. 20, was it that much? No, the whole program cost $1.5 trillion. $1.5 trillion to build a fleet of planes that are so advanced, so technologically superior. There is not another plane in the world that can even remotely deal with it. So in other words, it's like if the rest of the world's using second generation jets, it's like sixth generation jet. So we don't need this like this, but guess who does need this? Lockheed Martin, Boeing. This creates enormous amounts of wealth for those businesses. So Wilson recognized, and this is where I was talking about the myth of the munitions maker. The myth is after World War I. The reality is after World War II, right? And so after World War II, we really do have what's called the military-industrial complex. Now, to give you a sense of perspective, everything you see here is an example of military excess. In fact, the Defense Department didn't want these things. So why does Congress appropriate money to build these things? What I get really sick of hearing is how people who make 18 grand a year and get $3,000 or $6,000 in welfare are sucking it off the government, right? When these companies get billions of dollars a year and nobody's complaining. And the reason is because they make jobs. Right up the road is Babcock and Wilcox. They make parts for nuclear submarines, right? Nuclear submarines. So that doesn't make you a scholarship for your school, right? That doesn't create more libraries. So these are actual things that the Defense Department said we don't want. And Congress still paid for them because it would put jobs in their district. So if you don't think we have government created jobs in this country, you're looking at it right there. Not just the people who fly them, but the people who make them. Right? So we have so many, just go online sometime and type in airplane graveyard. Okay? Which are airplanes that have never been used in combat that are now retired. So we spend billions of dollars on this every year, $600 and some billion, right? Huh? No, and most of it isn't even for the types of wars we're going to fight. Most of these weren't. No, this stuff wasn't used. The ones that, like the Littoral combat ship, the LCS, this thing was so bad it sank in Iraq. John McCain held hearings on this thing. So why are we buying these? They're ineffective. They don't even work. You know, we don't need all these extra. This is the M1 Abrams upgrade. Nobody fights tank wars anymore. You know, so my point is, and of course, none of this has to do with World War I at the time, but Wilson did recognize that once you start building weapons for people as a business, which is what, you know, up until this point, America did not do that. America didn't typically make that many weapons, right? Maybe private weapons like firearms, but not for the world to use to shoot each other with. But once this becomes a business, people aren't going to be opposed to military excursions because that's what funds their job, right? And so we call that the military industrial complex. It emerges during the Cold War, and we definitely still have it now. Fifth, and man, this is inspiring. Fifth was to redraw colonial boundaries. So if you're a colony around the world, like say Vietnam, you're like, yeah, that's awesome. You know, we're going to become independent, right? Only if you were a German colony, right? Not if you were a French colony. Can't be on that side. Self-determination of minority people, that's in Europe. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to collapse, and the Russian Empire is going to collapse. But that doesn't mean the Brits in Africa, right? So therein lies a problem, and you should definitely mark this in your reading too. One of the major problems is that, and I think it's down here on number 47. No, yeah, 47. The major problem with the 14 points, beside the fact that it was sort of oversold, you know, and I'm going to show you the propaganda here in a minute, but is that the Allied leaders didn't agree to it. So like the Brits and the French, particularly the French, Clemenceau, these guys are imperialists. Like they're coming out of the imperialist mindset. You know, Churchill, who was in their navy at the time, was an imperialist. So they're not agreeing to this. They didn't sign up for it as a reason. They didn't fight the last 4 years of the war to end their empire. Right? And then also Republicans don't agree to this, particularly isolationist Republicans. You know, they're like, and granted, the Democrats controlled the government at that time, but they're not going to control it long. And unfortunately, the 14 points aren't going to really happen that well. And Wilson's going to have to give them away at Paris in 1990, as we'll see. But the one that he really, really sticks to is the 14th point. he insists that after the war is over, there be an international cooperative organization created, a group where people will talk rather than shoot. And you know, that's because what we know as the League of Nations. If you know anything about the League of Nations, we're not in it, right? Like it was our idea, and then we don't even join it. And the reason we don't join it, Republicans don't vote in favor of it. You know, so there are political realities here that Wilson is overselling something he can't deliver. One of the reasons why I don't talk politics that much because I don't like politics, even though I teach it. But one of the reasons why I was always skeptical of Barack Obama is that he was making really lofty promises, like promising to bring politics and Washington together, right? And promising to offer hope and change, right? And I was like, yeah, that sounds like politician talk. That doesn't sound like reality, you know? And so I tried to dig into the details of his campaign, and there wasn't that many. You know, he didn't have like a 14-point plan at the time. So, you know, I am always skeptical of presidents who use slogans that don't have any real beef. You know, where's the meat kind of thing? You know, so Wilson has lots of meat here, but the problem is he can't deliver on it. Like it's not a political reality. Neither could Obama. He couldn't. How is one president going to end in partisanship? You know, like how's that going to happen? Like I'd like to see that. So anywho, this is how the war gets sold. The word, of course, is propaganda, and propaganda is like a dirty word, a negative word, but really what it means is a government attempt of persuasion. If the government can't compel you by force, then it needs to manipulate your brain, right? And so this is a form of brainwashing. One scholar calls this manufacturing consent, so that you feel that you're freely agreeing to it, you know, even though you've been made to think, well, this would be stupid if I don't do it. So this is going to be led by a guy named George Creel. So it's frequently called this thing called the CPI, or the Committee of Public Information. The CPI, or Committee of Public Information, is routinely called the Creel Committee because this guy does a really, really good job of running it, i.e. he really, really convinces the American people. If he were selling you a car, you just bought it, right? So he's our sort of propaganda minister. And it is chock full of anti-German stuff. Like, keep in mind, the Brits and the French at the exact same time in history are keeping gulags in Kenya, right? And doing terrible things in Algeria and Indochina. I mean, they're imperial, right? But the bad guys for our story are going to be Germans. So routinely you will see the Creel Committee. Now, I will tell you, what did the Creel Committee do? They created posters, tons of posters. In fact, this is the poster war. If you go back and look up World War I posters, they're awesome. I mean, they're everywhere. So they put up posters, they set out pamphlets, they paid people to give public speeches. They recorded music that was patriotic and pro-America and pro-war. You know, so they had like feature films. Films start during this period. So they had movies. So tons and tons of, the culture was overwhelmed, so to speak, with the reason that the Germans were bad. So the Germans would be called the Hun, H-U-N, the Hun. You guys know who the Huns were, you know, these Central Asian warlords, horse lords. Perhaps you're familiar with a story of a large, you know, mammoth-sized gorilla storming New York and taking a lady, right? You ever heard of that story? King Kong, yeah. Well, here's Germany depicted as King Kong, and they're wielding a German word for culture, Kultur. Here, remember Belgium? You have what looks to be a little girl. You've got a guy in what's called a Pickelhoff, a German helmet, and he's pulling her off somewhere, probably to do abuse to her, right? So very provocative imagery. And they use this to support the various government agencies. They did this to sell bonds, like by the ton. Yeah, here's the Hun, you know, beat back the Hun, buy Liberty bonds, right? That's what financed the war, most of the war. Crush the menace of the sea. So here you see this blood-drenched hand out of a submarine. Here you see a movie called If Your Soldiers Hit. You know, and kind of like, what do you do when your GI comes back to America, you know, and how do you deal with that? Now, our soldiers are going to routinely be called doughboys. There's quite a bit of debate about why they were called doughboys amongst people who have this debate, you know, World War I buffs. But one of the reasons is they had a uniform that had, it was a deeper shade of green, kind of a forest green, and it had golden looking buttons, and they looked like blobs. And so some people said they looked like blobs of dough. But another possible reason is the American Red Cross distributed donuts when the guys got on the ships to go to Europe. They were called donut dollies. So these are like the doughboys, you know, as they went abroad. So our soldiers over there were routinely called doughboys. Okay. Perhaps you've seen the most iconic poster of World War I. I've got him over there too. The sort of angry Uncle Sam, right? Uncle Sam wants you. You see him on the bulletin board down. Yeah, he's covered up a little bit there, but I want you. Here you can see he's rolling up his sleeves to go kick some tail, right? Defend your country. So, you know, much of the war is going to rely on volunteerism. In fact, almost all of the war is, but there will ultimately be a draft created, as we'll see. Here you can see the Marines. It says down here, Huns kill women and children. So, by the way, there's no negative news coming out of Europe. And the reason for that is the Brits control the telegraph lines. So the Brits don't allow anything anti-British or anti-French to land in America. So all we're being fed, like nonstop, is anti-Germanism. And you're going to get some really, really crazy stuff going here. I love this poster. It's one of my favorite posters. On which side of the window are you? It reminds me of a poster in Britain during the war. It said, Daddy, what did you do during the Great War? You know, so this is shaming you if you don't go and enlist, right? Like, oh, you sat out the first war? Oh, okay, the Great War. Here you can see boys with the Boy Scouts, right? I found these posters very fascinating because they're needing to recruit people who are sometimes immigrants from Europe to go back to Europe. And so they need to recruit. And while this poster is very multi-ethnic, Wilson absolutely hated what he called the hyphens, right? You know, so here you can see all these names like Touart and Smith, O'Brien, Cheka, Holka, you know, Andresi. So they're from Italy, they're from Poland. And here they look like immigrants, right off the boat, either by a bond or, you know, better yet, enlist. Now, there actually was a national, I'm not going to say anthem, but a song of World War I. And the only way I can get you to hear it is to go to a full screen presentation. So give me just a second. And this is George Cohen, one of our first sort of pop stars. And he wrote a song called Over There. All right, so I'm going to play that for you now. Oh, you heard it? Okay, well, awesome. So he's singing, Johnny, get your gun. All right, that's the first part. Take it on the run. Pop song. Sorry, I didn't put the whole song on here. Maybe I should have. Over there. Over there. I love that thing. America are the Yanks, the Europeans. All right, stop that. So hopefully you guys were able to hear Cohen's song. I don't know how that worked on your end, but one of the tragedies of all of this, one of the problems of all of this successful propaganda is it's going to lead to a sense of, if you are damaged mentally or emotionally after the war, which many people were post-trauma, well, you must be some kind of weirdo because this glamorizes war. All of this makes war seem like it's fun, you know, and noble and a crusade. But what it fails to capture, none of it communicated successfully, the absolute horror of World War I, right? Like these guys that were signing up and they weren't understanding the reality of what they were getting into. And one of the things I am so moved about the American Armed Forces today is if you enlist in the military today, you know, particularly in the Army and the Marines, you know that you might be in combat. Like that's the reality of it. And our culture, while it still sort of glamorizes warfare, at least it's much more realistic. right? Like, so and I had a student years ago who was a combat Marine in Iraq, 2 tours, and he said, Mr. Touart, I'll never forget. I used to play Call of Duty and Medal of Honor in those games, and the first time a live round goes past your head, all that stuff goes out the window. He said, you just don't think of it as a game. It's real. And of course, he never, as a Marine, he didn't think of it as fate. But he said that's when somebody is shooting at you, trying to kill you, that changes you. And I'm sure it does. Like I can't imagine. I've never had that happen. Thank goodness. So this has the effect of really, really convincing Americans of how wonderful this objective is and how noble it is. And that's fine. But unfortunately, it comes with a price, a really terrible price. So I think that we have enough time today to also mention a few other things about the Germans before I move on. One of the more bizarre things that happened after 9/11 was the French did not vote in favor of our attack on Iraq. So the French have a veto in the UN, and so President Bush did not get authorization from the United Nations to invade Iraq. And a lot of Americans got really ticked off at the French. And so, for example, some restaurants stopped selling French fries and started selling freedom fries. That's what they call them. And I was like, seriously? You're going to actually do a World War I here? So what I mean by that is, and if you've read this or heard this, I'm sure you already know, but like during World War I, anti-Germanism was so serious. First of all, a German American got lynched just for his ethnicity. They banned the use of the word Frankfurter. That's where the phrase hot dog was born. You used to get Franks, hot dogs. That's what they were, Franks. But now they weren't going to be called Frankfurters. Hamburgers came Salisbury steak, right? Victory cabbage. That's one of my favorites. And people would burn instead of sauerkraut, which is pickled, basically spoiled cabbage. They would burn Beethoven music. I know, right? Like, what does that have to do at all with the Kaiser? But, all things German. They take down signs that had Germans on them. Prohibition happened. I can't forget Prohibition. During this period, now keep in mind, Prohibition had been going for a century. But now this is all the straw that breaks camel's back, so to speak, in a sense that beer was brought to America by Germans, right? Beer is a German word. And so keep in mind, if you're in Wisconsin, a lot of German descent, right? So Anheuser-Busch, that's a German family. And also we needed the grains to feed horses, to feed American soldiers. And so you're going to see the ratification of the 18th Amendment during World War I. So that's also noteworthy, I think, that alcohol is outlawed during this actual prohibition. So yeah, lots of anti-Germanist German sentiment. But perhaps I think in terms of domestically, the biggest mistake happens is a clear, I think today, violation of American freedoms. Now, the problem is that you're living in a period where people whose ideas were unpopular are considered un-American, right? And therefore you can silence them to a degree. So you have 2 laws passed, and they have similar names to another set of laws that were passed all the way back in John Adams' presidency that violated civil liberties too. They're called the Espionage Act, that's one act, and the Sedition Act, which you put them together as basically they usually are, the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, the Espionage Act, which is important, prohibits any actions that obstructed the war effort. So if you spoke out against the war, and quite a few labor organizers of the more radical vein, so like the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, Eugene Debs, this is when Eugene Debs gets arrested for speaking out against the draft, right, and speaking out against World War I. So espionage, today, by the way, the word espionage actually means like to spy, like to spy on someone. That's what espionage means. But during the context of this war, it means anything that interferes with like military preparedness. And that includes words. So the Espionage Act, and you could face 20 years in prison, right? Thousands of fines. And, the Espionage Act was pretty unfortunate. And so here's 2 of the labor leaders in America, organized labor leaders, who get arrested under the Espionage Act. Eugene Debs, who will run for president in 1920 as an inmate. He'll be a federal inmate. this leader of the American Railway Union, American Socialist Party. And then Big Bill Haywood was one of the two major organizers of the Wobblies, the IWW union, which were the most difficult work, really, like unskilled but brutal labor kind of workers. Now, the AFL-CIO, at the time it was still the American Federation of Labor, wholly supports the war. And I told you about Gompers. They don't play socialism. They don't get into that arena. They are going to be patriotically supportive, so to speak. And so, and they're really going to do this even more in World War II, and that's going to get them a lot of success with FDR. So unions aren't uniform, and they're like the far left unions are in opposition to the war and the draft. Keep in mind, they believe that the people most likely drafted are going to be their workers, and this is a way to silence them, kind of thing. So definitely Eugene Debs, I would be aware of. And then the other law, which is to me just absolutely baffling now, is the Sedition Act. And sedition is treasonous speech. The old Alien and Sedition Acts had this component in it. You may remember a congressman got arrested on the old one. So this made it a crime to in any way say anything abusive against the government. To speak in a manner abusive of the government. And so this, of course, is a fundamental, to me, curtailing of the freedom of speech. Imagine in the Vietnam War if this law had happened, right? Like, it would be totally different. And so your socialists, particularly, are going to be your biggest critics of the war. They see it as a sort of capitalist imperialist war, as they did in Europe. And so the American socialists are very much going to be opposed. Well, they're going to get arrested, and the American communists are going to get arrested. And the most notable arrest comes from a fellow in New York who's a communist. I don't remember his first name. Mr. Schenck is a communist, and there are others as well that are arrested who are giving speeches against the war and sending out flyers for communism. Now, keep in mind, communism is not illegal. It's just a philosophy. It's an intellectual belief. But Schenck gets arrested in New York. I think it's New York. Gitlow gets arrested in New York. I don't know if Schenck. I think he's in New York too. And the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And you have a fairly liberal justice in Oliver Wendell Holmes who hands down the first famous free speech ruling. So this is a ruling about free speech that says free speech can be curtailed, limited, in terms of the circumstances in which the speech is made. So this guy Schenck was standing in a group of people speaking out against World War I. Holmes is going to give the very famous maxim, that's like yelling fire in a crowded theater, which incites people to panic, right? So by speaking out against the war, he's causing harm. And this becomes known as the clear and present danger test. In other words, that type of speech will be limited. Today, that is not the rule. This is no longer the rule. Today, speech has what is called a preferred position. So unless your speech is literally hurting someone, like you're standing and yelling, they're called fighting words. If I'm standing in front of a black person yelling the N-word to incite them to fight, that's actually a crime. Okay? Like that individual. But if I'm standing in front of a crowd saying that, that's not. You understand? It's different. So you can say just about anything in America, like literally. And if you take AP government, we'll talk about freedom of speech in there and what you can't say, so to speak. But at this time in history, Schenck goes to prison, as did Debs, as does Gitlow, as does Haywood, for what they're saying. Not for what they're, any other doing, not like blowing up troop trains or anything like that, just for their words. Because their words are going to, in the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes, incite other people to do criminal activity, right? The clear and present danger. And Congress can do that. So it was upheld, this case. All right, we're going to finish today with the last couple notes down to number, I'm going to try to get to number 62, but if not, we'll survive. So there is an agency created called the WIB, the War Industries Board. It's run by a successful investor named Bernard Baruch, and Baruch has some major problems. So first of all, World War I is in no way like World War II in terms of how the American people operate with the war. World War II, you're going to see massive government sort of manipulation of society to get the war effort. World War I is almost entirely volunteer. Like they're just asking people to do stuff. All right. And so we were very, very disorganized. You had something like, I forget how many states we were looking at the time, but like 44 states, no central management of each state's production. We were totally ignorant of like how much gas we could produce, how many guns we could manufacture. So, you know, today we have the Federal Reserve, we have the U.S. Treasury Department, we have the U.S. Commerce Department. We know what America could do and does. You know, we can make projections. They had no idea, like completely in the dark. Lots of states had no interest at all in cooperating with the federal government. Like that wasn't their role. So the old states' rights argument, so to speak. And in general, progressivism had grown tiresome to a lot of people. And so the last thing they wanted was more government telling them what to do. So this wasn't going to be a war not run by the government that will. But there will be instances where the government, particularly the WIB, does start to do things. So eventually, the WIB is going to set quotas on production so that they can get enough from factories. The WIB is going to set price controls on what the government buys. Like you can't overcharge us, no price gouging. And, you know, for a very brief period of time, I think the WIB is going to see, and this is at the very end of the war, it's kind of like an exception to the volunteerism. The government is going to take over the railroad schedule. Railroads were not delivering the goods fast enough. So there will be a precedent set here of the government operating private businesses. In this case, they manage the train schedule because they got to get the trains delivering the goods to the war, right? And the other major change the government does during this period is they create daylight savings time, you know, to save energy, all right? But almost entirely the war effort is run by volunteer compliance. So you have several different groups that are going to use volunteer compliance. The War Labor Board is an interesting one. Former President Taft is going to run it. And basically, if you're a protester and not working or fighting, you're going to do one or the other, right? So this is a way to get labor to stop going on strike. And so, like I said, AFL, completely supportive of the work. They do get the 8-hour workday during this. So, you know, AFL's happy about that. The Wobblies, the IWW, who are routinely called the Wobblies in history, these are a sort of, they're almost communist. They're not Marxist, but they're certainly socialist. Labor union were the ones most frequently targeted as far as organized labor goes. Now, it looks like I did I not put the food agency in there? Good afternoon, all right, I'll pick that up tomorrow. I'm somehow missing Hoover here. I'm gonna stop sharing and stop recording.